part of the context of our seminar and our conversation tonight is the decision by Intellectual Property Australia, the IPA, to conduct a consultation around the prospect that geographical indications would be recognised. This is very much in the context of the negotiations between Australia and the European Union over the trade agreement. But of course, the implication is not just something that is bound up in a bit of paper. It's something which has practical consequences for the legal structure which surround intellectual property rights in Australia. And so we would encourage all participants in today's seminar, if you are sufficiently interested in this, to pay attention to the Intellectual Property Australia website. They have a very clear signposting to the consultation hub, and the consultation closes on the 30th of November. So you've got a good 2 weeks to make your contribution to that wider debate. We of course already have wine geographical indications, but this is about the more comprehensive extension of the issue to other kinds of products, Australian products. And of course, this is an issue which does arouse some passions. There are historical, there are provenance, there are quite personal reasons why people get very interested and excited about geographical indications, as well as the commercial considerations. Matters of identity. In our particular European Union Centre, we have a very strong interest in regional development, and so our own particular approach is framed very much out of the contribution that geographical indications has made to rural development in the European Union. We have 5 presenters in the event tonight, and I'm going to introduce each of them in turn. I'm going to invite them to speak for 10 minutes or so. We'll take all 5 speakers in turn and then have a good time for Q&A and for conversation. Let me firstly introduce to you Raimondo Serra. Since 2020, he's Deputy Head of the Unit responsible for Asia and Australasia in the Directorate-General for Agriculture and Rural Development in the European Commission. And in that capacity, he is leading the EU teams who are negotiating the agricultural components of not only the EU-Australia agreement, but also the EU-New Zealand FTA, which is being negotiations being conducted in parallel with our own. He's been with the Commission for 24 years and had various positions in headquarters in Brussels. Let me welcome you, Raimondo. Terrific to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Bruce. And let me just start by saying that I'm really delighted to be able to address this wonderful Australian audience today. It's very early in the morning here in Brussels, but it was really worth waking up this morning to have this exciting endeavor in front of me. And I will try to very humbly bring into the discussion the EU experience on geographical indications that has been quite vibrant in the last 30 years or so. And in front of you, you have my PPT that I used to frame my presentation.
So let's move to the slide. First and foremost, when we talk about geographical indication, we have to try to understand what it is a geographical indication. And essentially, the concept is not that difficult to understand or to follow. It's a combination of essentially 2 components. One is the territory, a given territory, and then a given product. When you mix up the 2, and when the relationship between the 2 is unique, is something that cannot be obtained elsewhere, then you have magically a geographical indication. And most of you, as consumers, are acquainted to experiences like a particular cheese. In the slide in front of you, you have a cheese that comes from a certain region of France, the Alps. It's called Abondance. Some others may mention the unique experience of drinking bubbles coming from a wine in the Champagne region in northern France. All these products bring the unicity of being unique and then specific. And in this respect, they deserve to be protected. And in the EU, since the 90s, we have put together systems that were already existing at member states level into an EU level kind of legislation that protects these specific features of our agriculture. We have two schemes, but essentially it's one scheme declined in two. The difference between the protected designation of origin and the protected geographical indication is, let's say, for lawyers to appreciate, more than for consumers. The level of protection is the same, and the distinctive feature between one and the other is that in the case of the PGO, all the production phases take place in the geographical area, while in the PGI might be some ingredients coming from other areas. So you are certainly acquainted, next slide, with other products very famous in the EU. It ranges from Rioja in Spain, Grana Padano in Italy, Prosciutto di Parma in the same member state, or Jesus and Georgia in Portugal. It's very difficult to name all of them, as today we have in the EU more than 3,000 geographical indications. And the reasons of those rather appalling numbers is that the concept and the system works. It works very well. It works very well because it benefits not only producers, not only consumers, but producers, consumers, and the society altogether. Next slide. So when you see it from the producer's point of view, the system is very, very interesting for them. The name at stake is reserved just to producers that are able to respect the specifications. So they are able to produce the product at stake, respecting all the rules that have been prescribed and described in the so-called technical specifications. So it's not just a product coming from a given place. It's a product coming from a given place with certain characteristics. The other particular feature which is interesting for a producer is that the name is not reserved to one single producer or to an association of producers. It can be used by all producers respecting that specification. So in this way, it is, from an IT point of view, a collective intellectual property right. It's not a private one. And this is a very important feature of the system. The other interesting element of geographical indication is that their protection is not enforced by the private owner, as this private owner does not exist in the system as I just explained, but administratively. So authorities are able to enforce the GI holder. But all in all, what really matters from a producer perspective is that various studies in the EU, and there is one recent one published a few months ago at the end of 2019, show very clearly that the market is giving a premium to these products. The market, in average, offers a better price to GIs than conventional products. It's essentially more than double the price of a standard product, in average. And in certain instances, that gap between a conventional product and a geographical indication ranges 1 to 10, depending on the ability of the producers of the GI to create an experience around that term. Next slide. But Then there is the other side of the equation, which is important to consider for consumers. For consumers, when they get and they buy a geographical indication, they are guaranteed on the origin of the product, on a given quality that comes with that product, and that product is authentic. It's not an imitation. Because he knows that that product is controlled by independent controllers on the full value chain, the full chain is controlled in order to give to the consumer the insurance that the product is not a fake one. But why it is so important for the EU to protect those geographical indications, and when I say to the EU, I'm referring to the governments of the EU, is because this product, next slide please, gives an extra value to the society as a whole. It's by definition the anti-globalization product, in the sense that it cannot be delocalized. By definition, a geographical indication stays in the area of origin. So it maintains jobs and vibrant economies in rural areas. It is strongly associated with sustainable type of agriculture, with biodiversity, with the local know-how, and it brings a lot of tourism. I'm sure that you are familiar in Australia with the various wine routes that we have developed over time. I've been experiencing myself Barossa Valley, for example, or Kings Valley, and in the EU you can find it all. You can find it for all the more than 3,000 GIs. There is the ability and the habits of tourists to follow tourist routes, following their nose or their belly, and you experience unique products. It works very, very well. So essentially, geographical indications are good food, good brands, and these two elements put all together, they create good business. And this is why it works. Next slide. Now, if you see it from a pure marketing tool point of view, the GIs are interesting because they guarantee, as we said, the consumers on various features of those products. But from an IPR point of view, next slide, what is really interesting for producers and for the society alike is that those GIs are not transferable. Those rights do not expire, as we know happen to other types of IP properties, like trademarks, if they're not renewed. And they can coexist with prior trademarks, but they are protected against the registration of subsequent trademarks. So they get definitely an advantage, which is linked to the collective nature, as compared to private-owned intellectual property rights. The next slides show to you the variety of geographical indications in the EU and the distribution between member states. It is just a fact that in member states there are different traditions. There are central member states that are more prone to use the geographical indication feature, and Italy, France, and Spain, and Greece, and Portugal are definitely having the golden share of it in terms of numbers, but it is now a common feature in all EU member states. And this explains the 3,281 figure that I gave you at the beginning of the speech. But now, moving little by little to the international arena, and I call it arena because when it comes to GIs, it's far from being a consensual concept. There is, as you probably know, a common feature established in the TRIPS agreement at WTO level that defines a geographical indication, provides a basic level of protection for all geographical indications, a higher level of protection for wines and spirits, where the use is prevented even if consumers are not misled about the origin of the product. So you can theoretically call a prosciutto di Parma made in Australia, and there is no issue from a legal standpoint if the consumer is clearly able to identify the origin of the product. The same cannot be said for champagne. Champagne should come from France, and there is no ability, according to TRIPS, to label champagne made in Australia. This is not lawful. But why then we see the need to get additional protection at international level? I don't know whether you are able to see some pictures that I put in my presentation, but the world is full of products using the names of geographic indications produced in countries different from the area of origin, and playing either with the concept of style, type, the line of the products, or using in very fancy ways those names to pretend to be something that they're not. So this is why in FTAs or in GI standalone agreements, the EU seeks for all geographic indications or for a short list of geographical indications, as is the case with Australia, to protect all GIs to a high level of protection, to protect them also from the GIs of the other side, and to get coexistence between prior marks and geographical indications, as well as the enforcement of those rights via administrative enforcement, not obliging GI producers that are sometimes, very often should I say, not equipped enough to go to court to litigate their rights. That approach in the last 15 years or so has brought as many as 36 agreements, which are now in force, and various trading partners. There are another number ongoing, including the one that occupies us today. And all in all, this is a rather success story, and the way the EU is achieving its goal to protect to a higher level a number of its symbolic and iconic geographical indications. But when it comes to today's talk, the focus, I understand, should be not only on the EU experience, which is just one experience in a concept which has gone definitely global, but to focus on to Australia. And in this respect, my last words would be, when you design a geographical indication system, please do not design it because the EU is asking you to do so, or because other important trading partners of Australia are asking you not to do so. But design your geographical indication system according to your needs, according to what really businesses on the ground need in order to be boosted and to be able to compete in markets which are global, but also local. Do not forget that even in the EU, where the GI concept is very important, of the GIs are consumed only locally, not even nationally, and not even at EU level. Only 20% of the geographical indications are able to escape the EU borders and go global. So this is a perfect global type of concept, but do not believe and do not forget that it's only global or it's only local. Local is very important. This is probably the place where the entire reflection should start from. Thank you for your attention, and more than keen to engage with the other panelists and with the audience in the discussion later on.
Thank you very much indeed, Raimondo. Let me just stop sharing the screen. Let me now introduce Ash Salardini. Ash, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Ash joined the National Farmers Federation in July 2020 as their Chief Economist and General Manager of Trade. Prior to joining the NNF, Ash was Chief Economist of New South Wales Farmers Association, Government Affairs and Public Policy Lead, Rabobank. Ash grew up in Tasmania and Sydney and studied economics, international studies and law at the University of Sydney and an MBA from the University of Warwick in the UK. Ash, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Bruce, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this very important and very topical issue. Now, I'm going to take you on a bit of a scenic journey to the eventual point we'd like to make on geographical indicators. So, the earliest evidence of winemaking as we know it today dates back to 6000 BC in the Zagros Mountains of Iran and mountainous regions of Georgia. By 2500 BC, grapes were being cultivated in the manner you see today in vineyards for the purposes of winemaking in a little Persian town called Shiraz. By the 14th century, Shiraz wine was immortalized in the poetry of Persian writers such as Hafiz and Omar Khayyam. By the 17th century, French merchants wrote of accounts of red wine from Shiraz that truly captured the imagination. In the 19th century, a Scottish trader by the name of James Busby exported Shiraz or Syrah vines to Australia, and in his journal he wrote, according to the tradition of the neighbourhood, the plant Syrah was originally brought from Shiraz in Persia. From there, the term Shiraz or Syrah became synonymous with red wine across the world. Based on the logic and principles of geographical indicators, wine, and particularly Shiraz wine, can only be called so using the grapes found in and around the city of Shiraz. All other wines cannot use the word wine or Shiraz to evoke the regionally specific drink of ancient Persia, one immortalized by the Persian poets. Fermented red grape juice might be an acceptable alternate term. Now, the twist in the tale is that the modern day Shiraz wine does not share the genetics of the grape found in the city of Shiraz. Even worse, evoking a geography of produce fraudulently. Now, what would this claim do to the current day winemakers who have relied on the terms for centuries? Fermented grape juice would be very hard to market as a luxury product, and I dare say demand for fermented grape juice or red wine would go down. There is the years of marketing and branding that has gone into the wine brands that would be wiped away in an instant. And then there's the real cost of changing labels and product design to meet with this new geographical indication. Now, is this upheaval really justified? Do consumers drinking Shiraz wine today really think that their wine is being made in the Islamic Republic of Iran? Or that somehow there's still some link with the Iranian city of Shiraz? Probably not. And so I'd like to come to the Australia-EU FTA negotiation and the issue of geographical indicators, particularly as it affects dairy. And I think the Shiraz wine example is a very pertinent example and sort of paints a picture not too different from what's going to happen in dairy. Now, firstly, I'd like to point out that Australian farmers are the strongest proponents of free trade in the world, maybe running second to our New Zealand cousins. So we very much look forward to a successful conclusion to the EU FTA negotiations. We are free trade orientated and will always be free trade orientated. However, the purpose, if not the sole outcome of a free trade agreement, is to find win-win outcomes for all stakeholders involved in the negotiations. And frankly, the GI regime advocated by the EU, combined with caveats around sensitive agricultural commodities, means that they are making losers out of Australian agriculture on the most. This is particularly the case for dairy. because there are significant numbers of tariffs on Australian dairy. There is preferential access for our main competitors, such as New Zealand, to the EU. There are significant non-tariff barriers for dairy to the EU. And the EU trade stipulations simply add cost to industry. And for example, we're talking about environmental standards and animal welfare standards that aren't looking just for outcomes, but looking for certification, which is a cost, not an outcome. And why this is not going to change in the future is because there's not much prospect of significant change under the FTA. Dairy, as an example, has been deemed as a sensitive agricultural commodity, and the caveats have already been placed around the freeness of that trade. Laid on top of this is the potential cost to Australian dairy producers that the geographical indicator regime would pose, where commonly used terms such as feta, Gruyere and Parmesan potentially will no longer be allowed to use. This would have dire consequences on our dairy processors. IP and branding established over many decades would be wiped away in an instant. There will be costs to rebranding and labelling, and demand for these goods will fall. So if your cookbook asks you to use 400 grams of feta, would you use 400 grams of Australian continental style white cheese in brine? I dare say you probably wouldn't. You'd probably stick with the feta as the ingredients or the recipe would dictate. Now, Dairy Australia has calculated the cost of this will be in the order of $70 to $90 million per annum, and in the medium term, or a aggregated level of $270 million. All this cost for what? Do Australian consumers actually think that feta in the supermarket aisles are from Greece? I think most consumers don't. Feta has become synonymous with a style of cheese, not a geography. And what about Danish feta? Does Danish feta come from Greece, or is it harking to a Danish heritage? So there's some confusion around some of the common sort of compounding names for feta. Experiences in other jurisdictions demonstrate the fraught nature of GI regimes that the EU are trying to attain. EU officials are trying to secure stronger protections in Australia than other FTAs, such as the one with Canada, that allowed for products already produced in Canada to continue using some common GI terms. There has been cases brought against producers in other jurisdictions because their labelling evoked a geography deemed to contravene the GI regime. The colour of the packaging may have evoked a country's flag, or the emblem or the crest of the product may have evoked a European region. Not only is this fraught, but an affront to Australian multicultural heritage. We have a rich history of European migrants establishing thriving business here in Australia and proudly displaying their heritage on the goods they sell. The GI regime would suggest we behaviour. To be clear, there are significant benefits to the Australian EU FTA for both countries. However, to realise these benefits, both countries need to work very hard at ensuring the broadest set of outcomes and benefits for the broadest set of consumers on both ends. And unfortunately, as it stands, it would be very hard for agriculture to see a lot of benefit. Not that there isn't any, but a lot needs to sort of happen between now and the end of the negotiations to sort of give agriculture in Australia a clear benefit from this EU FTA agreement. I'll leave it there and look forward to the question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ash. Let me now introduce Dr. Paula Zito. Paula, it's great to have you with us also. Paula is a legal practitioner in the areas of intellectual property and commercial law and an associate teacher in law at the University of Adelaide. She completed her doctorate on geographical indications, what is their worth, a comparison of geographical indication registrations between Australia and Italy, and she is a food geographical indications in government and industry. Welcome, Paula, and I believe you're going to share your own slides.
Thanks, Bruce. I am. Just give me a moment to do that. Can you see that?
Not yet, but let's give it a few seconds. I think from my experience before with Raimondo's, it's a bit slow. Still not. Yes, coming now. There you go.
All done?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much, Bruce, for asking me to join this panel. It's a great conversation already. I am going to explain why using food GIs in Australia would be very worthwhile. to regulate and protect the connection between Australian regional food and origin, as well as to protect the value that we have in many Australian regional names, and of course the reputation that many of our beautiful regions have for producing quality regional food, as well as wine, which is already protected. And also I'm going to explain the case that exists at a local and national level for the implementation of a food GI framework. So really picking up on some concepts of the importance of GIs at a local level, as Raimondo has introduced us to, really important. So since I was conferred my doctorate in 2018 by the University of Adelaide, I've been very proactive in this area in promoting the benefits of a food GI framework with the Australian food industry and government. I do recommend that an Australian food GI framework would be a great framework, a really ideal framework to protect the connection between Australian regional food and origin, and the value that exists in many of our Australian regional names that are commonly used on food labels to make origin claims. Clearly, there has been increased attention on food GIs in Australia since June 2018, given the commencement of negotiations of the Australian-European Union Free Trade Agreement, and of course, most recently with the government's opening of the public consultation on a possible new GI right for Australia, which is really why we're here together today. In order to fully understand the value that GIs can bring to the connection between regional food and origin, regional names and regions, I've researched how regional food can be connected to origin and how that can be effectively protected pursuant to a dedicated GI framework. I've carried out field work in the EU, specifically Italy, given that it's got the highest number of food GI registrations. I think they're at about 309 right at the moment just for food. So great case study example. And at a more local level, I've carried out a lot of field work and research in South Australia with a particular focus on Barossa Valley and Adelaide Hills. And I have recently published results and findings from my South Australian field work in the Australian Intellectual Property Journal in a 2-part article series. Volume 31, Part 1 is available right now, and that's what's referenced on the screen for you. So for those of you interested in learning more about the findings of the South Australian case study, please feel free to have a look at that. So in order to really highlight the case that does exist at a local and national level for the implementation of a food GI framework in Australia, I am today going to focus on Barossa Valley as the region to take note of. So one of the main reasons why regional food producers based in the Barossa Valley are very interested in a food GI framework is because substantial value exists in the names Barossa Valley and also Barossa for the purposes of regionally branding food products. The names Barossa and Barossa Valley have value not only because they should indicate the geographical origin of food products on which they are used, but also because of the secondary meaning that those names provide to food products. They actually infuse the food with certain values and characteristics and imply that they are attached to the regions because they have certain qualities that come from the Barossa. And research has shown, and my fieldwork has shown, that consumers tend to respond very positively to food products that are branded with Barossa or Barossa Valley because consumers are aware of the reputation that the region has for producing quality food products, and also because of consumer demand, especially over the last 2-3 years and even in the last few months due to COVID, for local products and really sourcing products from paddock to plate, fresh seasonal ingredients. Unfortunately, though, in many circumstances, food products that are branded with the names Barossa or Barossa Valley have a very weak connection with the region and sometimes, quite sadly, have no connection with the region at all. So to put this into perspective, an example of such a product is this one here, Barossa almonds, sold at IGA and Foodland stores throughout South Australia. It's very likely that even you, seeing this right now pop up on your screens, or consumers, would think that there is some relationship between the almonds and the Barossa Valley region. So as an example, you might think, consumers might assume that the almonds were grown in the Barossa Valley. You might think that the almonds were sourced from the region, maybe that they were packaged in the region. They might also assume that the almonds are of a certain quality because they come from the Barossa Valley on seeing that label on the product. However, there is actually no connection between these almonds and the Barossa Valley. On the producer's website, the business discloses that based in Virginia, on the edge of the famous Barossa wine region, Virginia Farm Produce grows more than 400 acres of almond groves. However, Virginia Farm Produce is drawing a very fine line in representing that Virginia is on the edge of the Barossa Valley. This is because Virginia is in fact located approximately 48 kilometres from the Barossa Valley region and more than 30 kilometres beyond the furthest reaches of the coveted wine zone of the Barossa. So Virginia is not in the edge or in Barossa Valley region. However, this food label falls just short of being misleading or deceiving because on the small label printed on the front of the packaging, which isn't entirely clear, but it's where my arrow is, it actually states that the almonds are in fact grown and packaged in Virginia. So this is an example demonstrating how many food producers and traders in Australia are currently using regional branding on food products. Many are using it to make an origin claim and free ride on the value in regional names and on the regions such as the Barossa have, notwithstanding that their food products lack a clear qualitative connection with the region claimed. So why is this happening? It's happening because of deficiencies with current laws and regulations in Australia that attempt to regulate how food producers and traders can use Australian regional names on food labels to make origin claims. There's three main areas of laws and regulations that try to dabble in regulating how origin claims can be made on food labels. Firstly, consumer protection laws. Secondly, passing off. Thirdly, trademark laws. These laws are deficient in the following three main ways. Firstly, they allow food producers and traders to use regional branding on food labels that fall short of being misleading or deceptive or involving passing off, even though the food has only a weak connection with the name region, as we've just seen with the Barossa almonds example. Second, they don't give regional food producers enough ex-ante guidance as to when they can make an origin claim on food labels and products. This is especially where some of the ingredients are sourced or some of the food production takes place outside the named region. There's quite a bit of confusion on this point. Third, they don't adequately regulate whether there is a clear connection between food and origin before a regional name can be used on a food label to make an origin claim, which again, the Barossa almonds example has shown us. And unfortunately, it's only where a complaint is made about a place of origin claim on a food label, and if that complaint is actually taken further and investigated by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, that the Commission will step in and regulate whether a food producer has complied with the general requirement of accuracy for the purposes of our consumer law. So the ACCC doesn't regulate whether food producers comply with that requirement before they use regional names on food labels to make place of origin claims. Rather, the ACCC and consumer protection laws rely on food producers and traders to ensure that they are making accurate claims. Unfortunately, though, this is inadequate regulation and protection of the connection between Australian regional food and origin. Accordingly, problems arising from these deficiencies mean that food producers are able to take advantage of and free ride on the reputation that Australian regions have for producing quality, authentic regional food products. and the value that accordingly exists in relevant regional names. This sort of usage of regional branding and free riding is causing the following four main problems. First, Australian consumers can't rely on or trust food labels that include regional branding to obtain accurate information about the origin of food products. Second, regional food producers are being deterred from making additional producing regionally branded food products. They get very frustrated with investing time and money in making a food product that is in fact connected to their region, obviously investing and providing value in their regional names. If food producers and traders clearly disconnected from the region can also use that regional name on a food product, notwithstanding a lack of connection. Third, the value that exists in Australian regional names as identifiers of authentic regional food products that have a clear connection with Australian regions is not being adequately protected. And fourth, Australia risks losing the assets that it has in Australian regional names, and that has the potential to affect our regionality and our agricultural and agri-food industries. So in order to overcome these problems and deficiencies, a food GI framework would be effective in regulating and protecting the connection between food and origin. It would provide more automatic protection to that connection by ensuring that food is actually connected to place before regional names can be used on food labels to make an origin claim. Any use of a regional name in the form of a food GI on a food product that isn't connected with place would automatically be an infringement pursuant to a food GI framework, just as it is pursuant to the Australian wine GI framework for wine GIs. So it would protect the value that exists in our regional names, as well as the reputation that regions have for producing quality regional food, ensuring that food GIs are only used on products that are linked to place. Very importantly, a food GI framework would provide one practical and effective legal framework dedicated to protecting the connection between food and origin, rather than trying to provide protection across a patchwork of laws and regulations, which is really quite confusing for food producers and consumers. It would also mean, and this is also very important, that the current differentiation that exists between the regulation of Australian regional names used on food labels via the wine labels pursuant to our Australian wine GI framework would be done away with. And accordingly, that would mean consistent treatment, protection and transparency from grape to glass and paddock to plate. So as some of us already know, we've had wine GI framework since 1994, and that's placed the Australian wine industry a step ahead of the Australian food industry. And that's really because the protection afforded to the connection between grapes and place, Australian wine GIs and regions surpasses the protection afforded to the same regional names used on food labels to make origin claims. So it really is time to develop GI protection in Australia, as there is a very strong case for the implementation of a food GI framework at a local, national level. I have submitted my recommendations to the Australian government regarding the worthiness of using food GIs in regulating the connection between Australian regional food and origin. That's in direct response to the call for submissions in relation to the AEUFTA, but also as part of this public consultation process on a possible new GI right. For those of you who are interested and would like to refer to some of my publications, these are some of them up on screen. But I think that Australia is in a really great position of opportunity to be proactive in implementing a GI framework that works for the Australian food industry. The GI negotiations and this consultation are a really great opportunity for policymakers to work with entrepreneurs in developing connections between places, products, local Australian culture, and to develop GI protection in Australia to really effectively regulate between Australian regional food in origin. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering questions later on. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Paula. Next, at a different perspective again, let me introduce Will Studd. Will Studd has been working with specialist cheese for over 4 decades. He began with delicatessens in central London in the 70s before coming to Australia, where he has, I think, far more than anybody else promoted a greater understanding of what good cheese is all about. He's the executive producer and presenter of Cheese Slices, 64-episode television series about artisanal handmade cheeses. Will, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. That's great to be here. Look, cheese is primordial. It's one of the most complex and intricate of all natural fermented foods, and the bacterial cultures that shape it are defined by the land from which it originates. The world's classic cheeses owe their unique qualities to their origins of terroir, the combination of climate, soil, season, pasture, animal breeds, and centuries-old skills and the craft of the cheesemaker. They take their names from the regions, their types and methods of production, and have produced in the Europe today under a strict accreditation system. There's really no argument about whether cheese represents, or classic cheeses represent a region. And it's no coincidence that many of the great PDO benchmarks are also made from raw, unpasteurized milk. And the reason for their enduring reputation is undoubtedly their flavour. You only have to taste them to know they're really different. Now, in my game, specialist cheese is all about celebrating and experiencing these differences. I'm not interested in bland commodity industrial cheese that is churned out and tastes the same every day, and particularly those that stand in and pretend to be something that they're not. I'm interested in cheeses that have a story, that represent an authentic taste of place and a link to a specific place of origin. Since the Industrial Revolution and the development of pasteurisation and cooperative milk, there's been a seemingly unstoppable global progress towards mass production of cheese, driven by the goal of cheaper and more convenient commodity milk. And Australia is one of the major players in that game. Since World War II and the creation of the EU, this so-called progress has accelerated. And when I started in cheese in the late 1970s, many of Europe's most well-known benchmark cheeses were very close to extinction. And then something happened, and it's important to what this was, okay? There was a consumer-led revolution, led by people who wanted to know how and where their food was produced. And this led to a demand for tastier, more interesting cheese with distinctive flavours and textures. Consumers really created a movement that saved the traditional cheeses of Europe and led to a resurgence of interest in artisanal cheese making in Europe and North America. In 1981, I migrated to Australia and found an even more extraordinary situation. When I arrived here, Australia didn't have any artisan cheese, none. The whole industry had been based around the export of commodity cheese and butter, and the consumer revolution of the 80s encouraged a new bona fide local cheese culture to blossom, and young artisan cheesemakers began producing hundreds of unique local cheeses that combine European traditions and exciting new ideas. Most of these new Australian cheeses were closely linked to a region by name, rather than cheap knockoff copies of European classics. More than confident that Australia today is well placed to take advantage of any GI system and will continue to produce unique Australian cheeses. You only have to look at the wine industry to see what we can do given the opportunity. Now, that all should be a great or very good news story for the Australian dairy industry. But sadly, local artisan cheesemakers face a very uncertain future when it comes to authentic GIs. Why? Because of the heavy-handed regulatory approach of the Australian authorities. There's a very close correlation between Food Standards Australia and New Zealand's Food Standards Code, Australia's big industrial commodity cheese producers and the Farmers Federation, and Australia's trade position with the EU over GI protections for traditional cheese. And for the past 20 years, this has had serious ramifications for the development of Australian artisan cheese compared to what's been happening with artisan cheesemakers overseas. A good example would be when I started in this industry, Australia was one of the first of the commodity producers to be making really interesting artisan cheese. If you look at the US now, they are leap years ahead of us when it comes to great cheese. Pretty sad. When the EU developed PDOs and GIs, it was a really important step in protecting the future of traditional cheese. But unfortunately, it was seen as a trade threat by commodity producers like Australia and US. In 1999, Australia and the US filed a WTO dispute over EU GI protections. And I don't know if it's a coincidence, but the following year, the newly formed Australian National Food Authority introduced national dairy that applied to both large industrial commodity cheesemakers and the new breed of small farmstead artisan producers. Arguing food safety, this new code required all Australian cheese to be produced from pasteurised milk, or the equivalent in bacteria reduction. This effectively banned both local production and the sale of all imported raw milk cheese for the first time. Imagine the look on the faces of the Italians down in Carlton when they found they couldn't get Parmigiano Reggiano and Grana Padano. I remember that day well. Anyway, Australia had effectively created a trade barrier that prohibited the import of many European PDO cheeses that until that day had been freely sold in this country. It raised a very important question. Was this really an attempt to create a trade barrier against European traditional cheese? And had Australian artisan cheesemakers been mistakenly caught in the crossfire? Or was the new policy intended to target not just the EU, but the growing number of Australian artisan cheesemakers who threatened the big cooperatives? In 2002, I formed the Australian Specialist Cheesemakers to lobby the government for changes to standards and allow the local production of raw milk cheese. Why? Because I want to taste Australian cheese made from raw milk, authentic Australian cheese that is comparable or perhaps even better than that made by our counterparts overseas. I'll say that again. Why? Because I want to taste authentic Australian raw milk cheese that is comparable or perhaps even better than that made by our counterparts overseas. That's not a big call. When the new regulations came out, I was met with a blank wall for any changes in Australia. Meanwhile, Switzerland threatened to take Australia to the WTO over the ban, which led to a special exemption being granted in the code for Swiss Gruyere, Emmental and Spritz. Italy followed up with similar action over the ban on Parmigiano Reggiano and Grana Padano, and were appeased when Food Standards Australia and New Zealand added a new special exemption to the code, recognising the Codex definition of hard-cooked grating cheese, and also agreed to undertake a review of the standards for hard-cooked cheese types, which were announced some 6 years later. In 2004, I applied for a special exemption for English farmhouse cheddar made from raw milk and the recognition of all EU raw milk standards as equivalent under applications A530 and A531. At the time, Food Standards Australia and New Zealand had to agree to the review, but they requested an extension of time whilst they undertook a review of all domestic raw milk cheese production standards. These took another decade before they were announced. In 2005, I sought clarity on the Australian standards requirements that specify that all cheese must be produced from pasteurised milk or the equivalent in bacteria reduction, by importing 80 kilos of French Roquefort and requesting it was tested to Australian micro standards for equivalence. The request was refused. The shipment was ordered to be destroyed by deep burial. I took the case to a court of appeal, and after threats of jail, fines, and public accusations of food terrorism by our wonderful dairy authorities, I finally lost the case 18 months later, and a very public funeral followed. We popped the cheese in the back of a hearse and took it across the Westgate Bridge and buried it at the Brooklyn tip. And the good thing I did was take the TV cameras along with me. What I didn't realise at the time was the Roquefort Challenge had become an unofficial test of the principle of equivalence and the international food safety regulations announced in 1998 by the Codex Committee following the Uruguay round agreement. This stated that from raw material production to the point of consumption, the products covered by this standard should be covered by a combination of control measures which may include, for example, pasteurisation, and these should be shown to achieve the appropriate level of public health protection. The statement established the right of individual countries to decide what constitutes the appropriate level of public health protection and opened the way to include mandatory pasteurisation in national food safety standards and a ban on the production and sale of all milk cheese. That was 1998. 2 years later, Australia gave it a go. So much for free trade. But more importantly, the statement also allowed other GATT member nations under the Codex to use any combination of control measures that provided the same level of public health protection. France was most unhappy with the Roquefort decision because it established a dangerous precedent. And if Australia could ban Roquefort, so could the US and other countries. And after a year of discussions, threats of WTO litigation, and volumes of documentation, Fazan's published a special 171-page report about why Roquefort was safe for Australians to eat. This is a cheese that has been made in France for 2,000 years. It was the most popular blue cheese in France, and no other country on the planet had managed to ban it. And you know the funny thing? Ironically, 13 years later, i.e. now, after Roquefort was granted a special exemption under the standards, it's the only, I'll say this again, it's the only imported raw milk cheese officially allowed for sale in Australia under our standards. When new Australian domestic standards for raw milk cheese were announced in 2014, hard cooked curd cheeses like Gruyere, Parmigiano Reggiano were reclassified as pasteurised. That's a world first too. And the new regulations made it totally impossible for most local cheesemakers to make any other type of cheese from raw milk. The special exemptions in the previous code were removed, and the ban on European imported raw milk cheese was tightened further. In 2017, Fazan's handed over responsibility for assessing all imported raw milk cheese for equivalence to the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources. From 2017, all applications for European raw milk cheese now had to be made on a government-to-government basis. Individuals like me could no longer make an application, government-to-government basis. And they had to meet Australia's strict new production standards. So in other words, if you wanted to sell raw milk cheese in Australia, you had to make it like an Australian, except we're not allowed to make it. Great. In 2018, France reapplied for Roquefort to be approved by the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, and the British made an application for 14 raw milk cheeses. That's 2 years ago. And guess what? Nothing. Nothing. DAWR are still thinking about how they're going to meet the application because of the precedent it will set for our local cheesemakers. In 2000,
well, I'm wondering if you could draw your comments to a close, please.
I will. In 2019, Fazans withdrew their agreement and to review applications 530 and 531, and the AAT upheld their decision. So, geographically, offer a great opportunity for Australian cheesemakers, but only if they're allowed to produce cheese on a similar basis to the great cheeses of Europe. The risk of accepting GIs is that we will be left out in the cold, and all we'll be doing is producing commodity cheese.
Thank you so much, Will, for both the detail of that and also the passion. Talking of passion, I'm delighted to introduce our last speaker, who is Todd Babiak. Todd is the Chief Executive Officer of Brand, I think I should say the founding CEO of Brand Tasmania. He has a record as being founder and chief executive of companies such as Story Engine and People Are Places, and is a world renowned leader in brand development. Todd, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much. My board chair, Will, would say hi. Nick Haddo would say hi to you if you were here.
Yeah, good. Hello, Nick.
In 1839, Lady Franklin decided that there wouldn't be any more distilling in what we now call Tasmania. Things were happening here. People were drinking a lot, and she just decided to make distilling illegal entirely. And it was illegal for about 150 years across Australia. You could import, you could drink it, but you couldn't make it, until a man and his father-in-law went fishing in the north of the state, and they were drinking delicious Scotch whiskey. And as they were drinking it a lot, noticing that this beautiful water and this lovely air and that peat bog down the way makes for some possibilities for Tasmanian whiskey. Why wouldn't we just make Tasmanian whiskey? And they drank a little bit more and made a plan, and they got to Hobart and decided, let's do it. And that's when they realized it was illegal, not only for Tasmania, but the whole country. But they found if they just started making it, it would trigger legislation. They had partners and friends who knew people in Canberra, others who knew people in Hobart. They just started making the whiskey. They started to test it, allow their friends to drink it. It went quite well. It tasted different. It tasted Tasmanian. So they went to this place, the Tasmanian Club, to ask for some investment. And the investors tasted the wine or the whiskey and said, yeah, it's delicious. It's different. It's strange. We like it. But there's something you don't understand about this industry, Mr. Lark, that you're trying to get into. Number one, there's no way you could do this because the big marketing machines out of America and Europe would destroy you. And number two, no one thinks of Tasmania that way, as this artisanal boutique place with special things. No one's going to pay $150 or more for a bottle of whiskey, and that's what it would cost. So go for it if you like, but we're not investing. And Bill Lark did go for it. He went for it. It tasted beautiful. And as you may know, Tasmanian whiskey is some of the finest whiskey in the world today. And as people started quitting their jobs here in Tasmania to become distillers in whiskey, vodka, gin, whatever it was, they would approach Bill and say, could you please teach me what you've done? And he said, absolutely, as long as you follow a few rules. Number one, only use Tasmanian ingredients. Number two, focus on quality, not commodity. As Will was saying, we're not trying to get into the commodity game here with our whiskey. And number three, if anyone ever asks you for help, you have to help them as I'm helping you. Let's build an industry. Let's build something special, not just a quirk. And that's the true story of Tasmanian whiskey. Bill Lark will say when one of his competitors won the finest whiskey in the world competition, he was as proud as though it were his own. And that is a deeply Tasmanian story. And it's what we've been doing in our work, is finding industry by industry, individual by individual, company by company, how can we be uniquely Tasmanian about it? So I think what we're working on fits this conversation. We've been helping our partners across Tasmania tell their stories as powerfully as Bill Lark can tell his. And that's been a lot of our work, is making sure that we can create these powerful provenance stories. And then what do we do with it? And part of that might be protection. Our job has been culture. Culture is, I think, what we're talking about here. And what we've tried to do is create this expression that everyone can use. but we know it's individual by individual, and it's terroir by terroir here in Tasmania. We're literal about storytelling, as Will used the word story. We've actually looked at what is the plot. In all of our interviews, we did 450 individual one-on-one interviews with Tasmanians to find out what is it that they're most proud of? What is it that is uniquely Tasmanian, that feels like can only happen here? And the story they told was very much like the Bill Lark story. It was almost always a Cinderella sort of story, but not about money, about something meaningful, ideally, that can only happen here. And so that plot we heard, I suppose, was about adversity and feeling underestimated, and then pushing through somehow. That's part of the culture here. When you're isolated, you have to be inventive, and then something comes of it. What we found, if we take 350,000 words of notes and squeeze it down, I'm from a very loud place, and the quietness and charming humility of Tasmania is different. For a long time, Tasmanians said it was a bad thing, that no one noticed. The loud mainland of Australia didn't notice, and we were quiet. But now quiet is what people are looking for, at least certain people. And the hard work used to be a negative as well. You have to work harder for everything here. But the grit and determination and focusing on something meaningful, perhaps raw milk cheese, is that pursuit aspect. Even though it's impossible and they say no, perhaps we can be the place where we can get raw milk cheese off the ground. And then the quiet pursuit is what it's all about. And then ideally we have these extraordinary products that we're talking about today. To Will's point about commodities, Tasmania went through a long period, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where commodities in every industry started to crumble. Tasmanians can't really compete on price, so it has to be on something else. The wine industry, our GI here, obviously it's hard work, harder climate, but ideally extraordinary outcome. And so what we're doing is we're working with communities, we're working with individuals, we're working with regions to find out what is that uniquely Tasmanian product, how can we package it up, maybe create some cooperation around it, which you all understand is important for the GI conversation, and what is the feeling? And as we send it out into the world, how can we protect it? I know that Canna's on the line, and I think Helen is from King Island as well. King Island is one of those places that we can begin to experiment with. If you look at what is uniquely Tasmanian of this place, of this how we can use this provenance storytelling and then protect it as it goes out into the world. And I know we had an EU delegation there at the end of January, and it was a really nice opportunity to see the possibilities for Tasmanian GIs potentially, but certainly for provenance and culture. What we're trying to do as we tell these stories is make sure what's the best way for us to protect it as it goes out into the market. And whether it's looking at what you're doing or even looking at blockchain and other technology, finding a way to be a platform for storytelling and protection. And another potential opportunity for us here in Tasmania is it is culture. And is there a way for us to say everything we grow, do, and create was created with 100% Tasmanian renewable energy? That's something we're working on for the future as well. Turn closer to that opportunity. I had more to say, but I think we want some time for questions, so I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Todd. That was terrific, and I'm sure we would like to hear more. But thank you very much for leading us into the discussion. Some people have already been using the chat to ask particular questions, so I can encourage you to do that, or else please put your hands up. Let me call on my colleague Chloe Ward to perhaps ask the first question. Chloe, would you like to take the screen, as it were?
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone. Sorry, I'm just going to tilt this up a little bit. I'm hanging out on my lounge room floor at the moment. So a couple of months ago, before the lockdown, I was sitting in a very interesting meeting with some of our partners in Gippsland. Sorry, have you got me? No, I haven't frozen.
Yes, yeah, you're good.
We talked about precisely that issue of provenance, and Paula's around reality, I thought really interesting, hoping that the other panelists could perhaps explore that. So I guess my question is regionality, as Paula's suggesting, the future for food, goods and produce in Australia, and are GIs the appropriate framework for that?
I'm happy to start the conversation.
Yeah.
My work in this area, I am purely focusing on Australian regional food. So I suppose picking up on some points that other speakers have made, really looking at quality, authenticity, artisanal food rather than commodities. And so the cry out that I have received from regional food producers is that we should really be promoting our local, our regionality, our story, because one, at a local national level, that is what consumers are looking for more and more, but also at an international level, that's also what many of our trading partners are looking for as well. So the stories behind the food, the provenance behind the food, and making sure that there are frameworks that protect our provenance, both local, national and internationally, but also that we can protect, you know, our trading partners' provenance as well. So I think regionality, you know, is a huge factor. And I think that it is our point of difference and that we should be really proud of what we have, but we need a framework that adequately protects what we have, both locally and internationally. So that's where I come from on regionality. Chloe, if that assists you.
Thanks. Ash or Todd, would you like to respond at all?
Look, yeah, look, I think a lot of things have been sort of mixed into the soup of geographical indicators. So protecting the regionality of a product is to be commended and to be protected. That's a truth in labelling issue as opposed to a geographical indication. When we take common terms that have been used for decades, if not centuries, and say now feta, for example, is now synonymous with Greece, when clearly it's not the case, that's when we're starting to walk into some terrible sort of situations here. The second point is this sort of, you know, the small guy's been ripped off by this agenda. That's not true. Go down to your, you know, to Marrickville or one of the industrial areas where a lot of our cheeses are made. Passanella, as an example, Italian migrants, you know, making cheese in Australia for over 50 years. You know, tell them they can't use certain names anymore. Is that what we're suggesting now with geographical indications? By all means, say it's Australian feta. By all means, that's neither here nor there. It's a suggestion that feta is now synonymous with Greece, and that's clearly not the case. And if the concern was purely on, you know, provenance and, you know, consumer led, and, you know, we really sort of, the food speaks for itself. Well, let the food speak for itself. And it is all about protectionism, because if it was about provenance and it was about the truth in food, I'll come back to Shiraz wine. I come back to Shiraz wine and see the stink that it would create for people to suggest no one can call their grapes Shiraz, and, you know, from forevermore that wine has to be called something else. That's the issue here. So truth in labelling, that's fine. If your product's not made in Greece, you can't make claims that it's made in Greece. That is. But when we take common terms that has a meaning now as to the type of something, then we're straying into very, very fraught situations there. Now, the issue with raw milk has been some sort of conspiracy of big dairy. Very interesting. If we're going to start to sort of question science and question medical advice, then I don't know where we are at. So I just wanted to put forward, there's not been some huge lobbying by the dairy industry somehow to say, you know, because of commercial interests, we are sort of banning raw milk. In fact, a lot of dairy producers would like to make raw milk cheese. So I don't think it's there's some conspiracy now also being intertwined with some of this debate. So geographical indicators is one thing, truth in labelling is another, and regionalisation and provenance-based marketing and protections for that is another thing. What we're suggesting is some of the geographical indication frameworks is probably overstepping them.
Ash, how do you justify that feta isn't Greek? Where do you get that from? I get the Shiraz story, but where do you get the feta isn't Greek?
No, what I'm saying, the origin of feta is from Greece. But from now on, a consumer does not think that the feta in his store is from Greece. They might think Greek feta might be from Greece, but Danish feta, Bulgarian feta, Persian feta.
Well, they're not called that. In Europe, they're not called that. They've adapted. Why can't we?
And people have built a brand and they've built marketing, and the very same people you purport to represent. The Italian migrant, I'm not using a fake example. Passanella in Marrickville has been making cheese for 50 years. using things that would now offend geographical indications. And in
They
fact,
do. When I see Australian Parmesan, for example, masquerading as Italian-style cheese, it's a load of rubbish. Okay, it's nothing like Parmigiano Reggiano and Grana Padano. It's completely misleading mock-up. It misleads the consumer, and it does our country no justice to produce these copies of great cheeses. It really doesn't.
All these things.
So Ash and Will, I think you've each made clear points. Let's. Todd, I'm conscious that you are, going back to Chloe's first question, you are a region. I mean, is that very much the basis of how Brand Tasmania is trying to position itself?
I suppose, and I think the cultural question is one that we're keenly interested in. And for example, when we're looking at regulations here, we know that the regulations, dairy or meat regulations here, don't necessarily work for small operators. It doesn't allow for that imagination necessarily. Rather than fight with the dairy regulator, is there a way for us to find this is culture first, and then let's look at ways to protect people second? No one wants to flout any health regulations, but I think to Will's point, we want to encourage that local, special, can only happen here quality we're creating, and we want to make sure this is a great place to do it, whether it's in food or in another industry. So what we want to do is make sure, we want to tell the stories of what's already happening here. But since we understand our culture is about boutique, artisanal, practical, we want to make it an ideal place for that. We want all of you to move to Tasmania to start your business, frankly. But then down the road, how do we protect it when it's in market? That's still a question I'm very curious about.
Thank you. We've got a few questions in the chat. I think perhaps to move to those. Hazel has had an exchange in the chat with Raimondo about the benefits economically of GIs. Raimondo, would you like to speak to that question, that the exchange you've had with Hazel?
Yeah, it was a very, very straightforward exchange. He asked me the source of my quote of the 2.3 times the price for a GI as compared to a conventional product. I provided that source. It's a recent study. But as I have the floor, this brings me back to the Chloe's question, and I do not have the ambition to answer for the Australians. It is an entire debate that belongs to you. But just let me make 2 points. Australia has already experienced since a number of years with success the GI specific legislation for wines. And let me ask you a very blunt and open question. Why wines deserve a GI specific law regime and why cheese do not? Why there is children of a lesser God in the world of GIs? The EU point of view is that there are not children of a lesser God. They all deserve to get the same level of protection. And when you start thinking about a system to get that protection, which is effective and enforceable for producers, my very bottom line is that when you look into a trademark, you look into something that is able to distinguish a product from another. When you look into a geographical indication, you look into something else. You look into something that, according to the TRIPS definition, is essentially attributable to its geographical origin. And if you conduct the test of a trademark and the test of a GI on the same products, you likely arrive to a different result because you are looking to different features of that particular product. So to pretend that you apply your trademark system into a product and you arrive to the same level of protection of geographical indication is simply impossible, because you are really looking into different inherent features of that product. And Paula has exemplified very, very brilliantly how the use of a trademark focus cannot deliver such a result. So this would be my 2 comments. Then, bringing back to your question, Bruce, there is really abundant studies on the ability of a GI to produce, to create value as a brand for producers. But the EU story is not just about producers, it's about consumers, and it's about the society as a whole. And this is why we are so attached to geographical indications.
Well, to perhaps pick up on another question that Hazel has asked, she asks, is an EU-style system the right response or something more homegrown? Paula, would you like to say, Hazel, have you got your mic turned off, please?
Yes.
Paula,
you want it on or off?
Off. I could hear myself twice, which is never a pretty sight. Paula, you made some similar comments. What would an Australian system look like that would be different from the EU GI system?
I think importantly, we need to work out how food is connected to origin and place in Australia. So some of the things that I've given thought to and recommended is that at the very core, the ingredients, the core ingredients should be locally sourced from the region claimed on a food label. So if we're looking at Barossa as a food GI, then the core ingredients used to make a food product that is going to use that food GI need to be locally sourced. The difficulty, I suppose, is to differentiate it from the wine industry is that food has many ingredients. It's more complex. So while wine, we're focusing on the source of the grapes, it's easier. Food has more ingredients, so that's why I've come back to the core ingredients needing to be locally sourced. Also, we need a percentage as well to work across different food types. So that would really require input from regional food producers as to what that sort of magical percentage number would be. But that's definitely a requirement to take into account. Another requirement that I've looked at is where possible, because it isn't always, to have local production as well, depending on, obviously regulations within the area, local planning and government regulations too, infringing on that. But that is something that's come out of the fieldwork too, that where possible, some production should be taking place in the local region also. Another consideration is maybe in particular regions there are products that actually do have a traditional process or method that is distinct to that region to make a product, and that also could be a connecting factor. So I don't think our Australian culture wants too overly a prescriptive system, such as some of the EU GI requirements, because we do want to innovate. We do want to have that. But we do need to have some regulation to ensure that, in fact, food does have a connection back to place before we can just use regional names on our food labels. So they're some of the considerations that I've been putting out there.
Thank you, Paula. Ash, I think you again have put your views well about the importance of not cutting off the commercial position of some Australian producers. Would some of your concerns be allayed if there was, depending on a period of time for adjustment in Australia, so that there wasn't a sort of a sudden cut-off of particular practices, but time to adapt to a different system? Would that help to allay some of your concerns? If I can pick up we don't have a lot of time left, but pick up on a comment from Winting in our chat, who referred to the Canadian CETA and the extent to which their agreement recognised EU GIs, but there were no Canadian GIs. Should in fact Australia be more specific about some of our existing GIs, perhaps from the dairy industry, that we would want to have recognised in Europe?
Look, I think the first distinction to make is I'm not too averse to what Paul is suggesting around the system she's creating is actually very linked to the geography. The Barossa example is actually invoking the very specific region of the Barossa. What the concern is around terms that have come into common parlance, such as feta. Now, I use the Shiraz example because, you know, it is a history of 6,000 years, and yet we're all very comfortable to drink Shiraz, and we're all snobs about what Shiraz wine we drink and we don't, and we still think that's quality. So it's not the issue of around provenance-based protections for food. It's actually around when some of these terms have become common use, and then to stop the use of those words. And feta is the easy one to sort of draw out on. So regardless of how long that takes, you're actually taking away something of in common use and taking it away from people. And it comes back to the example of if my cookbook says 400 grams of feta, would I be happy to use Australian, I don't know, Greta cheese or whatever we want to call it? That's the issue that is at the heart of it. So no amount of time can sort of change that, because they've become culturally sort of a common sort of word. It has Greek feta, yes, okay. If you want to call something Greek feta, you're trying to invoke the geography of Greece to sell your product. You know, there is an issue there potentially. I don't know, but feta as a word is become synonymous, as is bread. You know, if we, you know, it starts to gets to a point where, you know, it's hard to then use that product without contravening a GI, and I think that becomes the issue for us.
Thank you. Look, I'm conscious we're at the end of our time, but perhaps can I just go around and give each of our presenters a last word, and if I can emphasise the singular, I don't mean one word, but if you could add, if there's a sentence you'd just like to share to draw our presentation to an end. Todd, would you like to have a final word?
Well, it's a good point about Canada, where I'm actually from, and as we were dealing with the EU delegation in King Island, you could see this real hunger for more GIs from this place, and we're certainly curious here, but we are focusing on making Tasmanian mean and taste like something into the future, and if GIs make good sense, we'd love to work with all of you on that sort of thing.
Thank you very much. Will?
In a country where milk is cheaper than water, where 75% of Australian dairy farms have disappeared in the last 30 years, GIs offer a really good opportunity to provide for small producers to evaluate their product. Otherwise, the world's going to look very different, and our dairy industry will suffer accordingly.
Thank you. Paula?
Let's be proactive rather than reactive. I think with the Canadian example, there's now research coming out that they're saying that, you know, more value can be obtained by Canadians if they turn their mind to what names they could too protect as GIs. So let's take this opportunity for us as Australians to think about what we have and how we can protect it as well, and what works for us.
Thank you. Ash?
I think the main point here is to maybe sort of maybe test some of our own assumptions. The presenters today suggest that, you know, these products and goods are self-evidently good and called by consumers, yet on the same sort of sentence would then go and must be protected by law and government. Now, that's very different from truth in labelling and letting the consumer decide. That jars with me, the very two sort of distinct sort of positions. One's it's self-evident and consumers are flocking to it. The next is, and government needs to protect it or it won't happen. So that's confusing me, I guess, as the last point.
Yeah. And Raimondo, the last word.
My last words would be that the FTA is not the end of the story. I'm sure that we will be able to find solutions for names as the ones that Ash has mentioned that are indeed problematic. But the real debate for you guys is how you make the system which is good for you. And that debate is totally independent from the FTA. The FTA is just an occasion and an opportunity.
Thank you so much to each of you. And can I back to the beginning? We have a consultation underway by the by IPA, Intellectual Property Australia, which is precisely directed at that opportunity. So I do encourage all of you who've joined this discussion to have a look at the Intellectual Property Australia webpage. to look at the consultation hub there, and indeed to share your thoughts with the IPA. If any of you would like to use our centre's help to negotiate those details, if you don't have access yourself, please get in touch with us at the EU Centre, and we'll be delighted to provide you with copies of the materials. But thanks so much to each of our presenters. Thank you, particularly Raimondo, for getting up so early. Thank you to the rest of our presenters and participants for joining us late in the day. I personally have found it a very interesting and stimulating discussion, and I think that we have some really important conversations to continue to have in Australia. Thank you all very much indeed. Have a good evening, and I'll enjoy a glass of Shiraz myself. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.